Because you got to, like, next month I start Medicare.
Yeah.
You must be on Medicare. Yeah. You know what? I hate it.
Okay, everybody, we are live.
I mean, you get a second.
That sounds like a committee. So we are, we're live and Kevin's actually in charge. Kevin?
Good morning, everyone. Kevin Burke with the Director of the Watershed Management Division at DEC. Also appointed member representing Secretary Moore at the Agency of Natural Resources. I'd like to first welcome everybody, all of our appointed members of the study group, our respected members of the Vermont General Assembly, environmental advocacy groups, the Green Mountain Water Environment Association, some experts from our business development and environmental consulting community, Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds, Responsible Wakes for Vermont Lakes, the Citizens Advisory Committee for Lake Champlain's Future, the Memphremagog Watershed Association, and we also have the Vermont DEC Watershed Management Division Monitoring Assessment Planning Program, along with Legislative Council. We also expect that members of the department's Lakes and Ponds program and others at the Agency of Natural Resources will be available for technical support and participation as requested by the group. Myself, as director of the Watershed Management Division, as I said, serves as an appointed member of A&R Secretary Julie Moore. Act 175 of 2026, also referred to as S223, established the Water Quality Lake Classification and Anti-Degradation Study Group to review related water quality issues related to the above anti-degradation water quality standards, with an outcome of recommending legislative or policy changes that will strengthen environmental protection, provide regulatory certainty, and support public uses, also referred to as existing uses, in our state waters. The group will be looking at Vermont's anti-degradation policy and how this relates to the water quality classification system for Vermont lakes and ponds to facilitate the next effort to solidify anti-degradation rules, for which DEC aimed to adopt in both 2023 and 2024 after significant stakeholder engagement, ultimately leading to an impasse, but a lot of work was done. The goal of this effort really comes down to having the regulatory framework in place to ensure Vermont has access to the tools necessary for protecting Vermont's highest quality waters. And that is classifying waters such the classification aligns with the existing water quality, essentially raising the floor for those high quality waters. By doing so, Vermont will be better apt to frame the protections and resources necessary in those watersheds to address any indicators or trends of water quality concerns, specifically some of the numeric criteria that we monitor for over time. There is a lot to accomplish, but I hope that we all remain committed to the charge and the focus of Act 175, and also aim for general consensus on the group's overall position as we navigate the issues. Shortly, we'll need to elect a chair and a vice chair for this group, and also establish some study group rules of conducting the work and making space for also public engagement and public comment. So again, thank you for your willingness to participate. And with that, really excited to pass this over to Senator Seth Baum.
Thanks. So just on the agenda, the next item is just for me to comment on why I introduced S223. Came about initially from a presentation we had from the Division of Lakes and Ponds in the Committee Natural Resources almost 2 years ago now, or a year and a half ago, where it really became apparent to me that the quality of our water in our inland lakes is maybe not drastically, not quickly, but it's headed in the wrong direction in many instances. And so I got a little bit alarmed by that. And then I began to get myself more familiar with the anti-degradation policy and realized that we've been working with an interim procedure rather than a policy for the last something like 15 years. And that I haven't been able to land on a functional anti-degradation policy. And those two things are tied together: classification, anti-deg, as Kevin mentioned. And I guess I began to see that there's actually a path forward here that can provide some of the it's always hard to have regulatory, to use that term regulatory certainty because every situation is different, but something closer to regulatory certainty and actually have a functional lake classification system at the same time. So that was really what I was intending to do, was seeing whether we can pull the players together from the side, from the people who might be the applicants and the people who are interested in water quality. And of course, everybody's interested in some ways in all of that. And whether we can put together something that makes it work better across the board for everyone. That's the goal here. So with that, next thing we have on the agenda, and by the way, just a comment, somebody had to think this through. So we pulled together a few people to begin to think through at least the initial agenda so we could use this first 3 hours as well as possible. And A&R obviously helped put this together, and the people who were sort of most responsible for thinking through the need for this process, which is, in some ways a lot of people in this room. So without going into all of that, we just did the best we could do to give us a good 3-hour introduction to this and some level setting so that we would all be sort of beginning to get on the same page and level of understanding about how this all fits together and the kind of choices and things that we're going to have to think through as we go forward. I also mentioned when I sent this out, we're not going to get through this agenda today. We're not going to worry about what we get through the agenda. We'll just get as far as we can get in 3 hours, and then we'll just pick up when we left off next time. So it's thoroughly overly ambitious. So the next thing we have on the agenda is to hear from Michael.
Okay, next on the agenda is going through the study committee's charge. Before I do that, I just want to note some of the documents that are in front of each member. You will see the actual Act number 175. You'll have 2 PowerPoint presentations, one related to an overview of water quality and one related to applicability and administration or implementation of the anti-degradation policy. There's also the A&R draft 2024 and 2023 anti-deg rules. They look pretty much the same. The way you can tell them apart is on the second page. The 2023 rule has 21 definitions and the 2024 rule only has 20 definitions. And there is also an anti-degradation implementation procedure from 2010. Those are effectively documents that you have in front of you in addition to the agenda. So I'm going to walk through Act 175. I am not going to post it to screen share it because it's relatively short and you have a copy in front of you. You'll see Section 1 of the Act creates the Water Quality Lake Classification and Anti-Degradation Study Group. And it is created in order to conduct evaluations set forth in subsection C, which we'll get into more in detail when we come to subsection C. But generally what subsection C requires is review of existing classified waters of the state and candidate waters with water quality data supporting reclassification, assessment of anti-degradation requirements, examination of the regulatory framework for classified waters, and examination of the adequacy of the current water classification system for lakes and ponds. And based on that evaluation, your overall charge is to recommend to the General Assembly legislative or policy changes to strengthen environmental protection, provide regulatory certainty, and support public uses of state waters. Then you have the membership of the group. There are 16 members, 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, the Secretary of Natural Resources or her designee, a DEC water quality scientist, technical staff member, 2 persons representing businesses, industries, or development that interact with water quality permitting, including the anti-deg policy and use of high quality waters, 2 persons representing nonprofit environmental advocacy groups, 1 person representing the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds, 1 person representing the Green Mountain Water Environment Association, 1 person representing the Memphremagog Water Association, and 1 person representing the Lake Champlain Citizens Advisory Committee. You're all going to introduce yourself to each other in a minute. And then you come to the powers and duties, that subsection C that was referenced in the initial charge to the committee. You are going to develop an inventory of the waters of the state with the existing classification designations. You are going to assess the state's obligations under the Federal Clean Water Act with respect to adoption of an anti-degradation rule to implement the state's anti-degradation policy, including an evaluation of any state and federal regulatory requirements and the identification of any barriers to full compliance. Page 3, sub 3, you're going to identify and evaluate the statutory and regulatory frameworks, rules, policies, and procedures governing Class A waters, including whether modifications are needed to facilitate the reclassification of eligible waters, adequately protect and support designated and existing uses, and provide regulatory certainty for activities in Class A waters. And then your last substantive charge is evaluate whether the existing water classification system in the state and related statutory and regulatory framework protect the ecological integrity of the state's lakes and ponds, and address current and potential threats to the water quality of lakes and ponds and provide regulatory certainty. And then last, that recommendation of legislative amendments and any rules, policies, or procedures that may require revision to implement the study group recommendations. The rest of the act is largely administrative. You have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance today, and already have the legal and drafting assistance of legislative counsel. You report to the General Assembly on or before December 15, 2026. A&R calls the first meeting, but you then are going to elect a chair or vice chair from among the 6 legislators. The study group ceases to exist on February 15, 2027, and you receive compensation if you're a legislator or a non-legislator if you are not otherwise compensated for being here. The rest of the act is unrelated to the study group's charge, and we won't walk through that. Generally, the next step with study groups is to elect a chair or vice chair.
I was just going to say, I think to start that process, we would need a motion to elect chair, a motion to elect a vice chair.
So I'd like to make a motion that we elect Senator Bongartz as the chair. And do you want to do it separately or together? Because my second nomination would be to elect Representative Sheldon as the vice chair.
Other motions, or we need?
Second that motion.
Do you want to do them together?
We can do them together. I'm fine with that.
Second.
Do we have any second motions for Chair Bongard?
Oh, did you want a
I
second?
just want to second
Okay.
Senator Watson's motion.
Do we have a second? So do we have an elected chair and vice chair? We have to vote. Okay,
Yeah.
so I apologize. Process. We can take a vote. All those in favor of Senator Watson's motion, say aye.
Aye.
All that opposed, say nay. Okay, we have a chair and vice chair.
So,
We probably need to get a system for the folks online.
Oh, right.
One member of the committee with his camera on, and I saw his hand up.
Griff Nelson is on that.
Are there other?
There's a hand raise function online.
Yeah.
It should be at the top of your screen. Or you can go like this into your camera.
yeah, I often get it that way.
Can I just ask, is this a Zoom interface?
This is Microsoft Teams.
Yeah.
So, okay. So then the next order of business, and I'm going to say one thing I forgot to say a little bit about why I introduced the bill is that I also have a sense that virtually every Vermonter, regardless of whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Progressives, whatever, cares about the health of our lakes. So I think that's something that is another unifying theme here with this with this legislation and with our charge. Hopefully we can bring everything together and move forward. So the next thing we wanted to do is just have people very briefly just sort of introduce yourselves and explain your connection to the charge or the connection why you're here. So we can start over here.
My name is Breck Bowden. I am representing the Vermont Citizens Advisory Committee for the Future of Lake Champlain. I'm a retired professor from the University of Vermont, Rubenstein School in Watershed Science and Policy, and was the inaugural director of the Lake Champlain Sea Grant Institute.
My name is John Groveman. I'm the policy water program director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council, or VNRC. I guess I've been thinking about and working on this anti-segregation issue in Warren, could say the same thing, for 20, 25 years, both at the Agency of Natural Resources, where I used to work, and at VNRC, and with the Water Resources Board, where I used to work. And so happy this is being looked at and to be part of the committee.
I'm Pat Swazi. I'm president of the Federation of Vermont Lakes and Ponds. We've also been working on this issue for a number of years. I've been working with those lakes who have petitioned to be reclassified, and we've worked on legislation previously around reclassification, and continue to work on this with some of the other groups that are here that have been working on it for years.
I'm Larry Sedgwitz. I'm representative from Randolph and sit on the House Environment Committee. And we've been working on this issue on and off for a good bit of time in our committee. So that's where my familiarity with it comes.
Senator Ann Watson, Chair of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee, and S223 came through our committee, but it is an issue that we have been talking about since I joined the legislature a couple of sessions ago.
Representative Amy Sheldon, Chair of the House Environment Committee, what they said, but I will just give a nod. This has been a conversation since my predecessor, who also had a high interest in getting it across the finish line. So hopefully it's going to be the final veto, and we move toward a rule for anti-DEG in Vermont.
So Seth Baumgartz, I represent the Bennington Senate District, and just have an abiding interest in all of this. So that.
Evan Burke, Director of the Watershed Management Division. I should mention that I worked for the department for 20 plus years, taking over for Pete Laflamme, who took a very well-deserved retirement back in October. My experience has been in stormwater management, but also some time in the Lakes and Ponds program. So I'm very close to these issues. I know this has been a topic of interest going back, as John said, 25 years at the agency. So we're hopeful that maybe this group can come together and make something happen. Because I think it's important to realize that protecting and maintaining water quality is much easier than restoring. So I think we need the right tools in the toolbox to get there.
Senator Terry Williams, I'm from Rutland District. I'm also the vice chair of the Natural Resources and Energy Committee. And, I agree with the chair Baumgartz how important water quality is. And, particularly for the people that don't realize it, we need to be transparent about this process, and we need to make sure that people understand that what we're doing is important for Vermont and for future generations. And I also, my charge with this committee, what I wanted to be on it, was to make sure that we have a vision statement for the committee and that we have a plan to get to that end state. Thank you.
Representative Michael Morgan. I sit on the House Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee. The nexus that I see for myself on this committee and the importance to me is that I represent the Grand Isle County and West Milton District. So all 6 of the towns that I represent border Lake Champlain, especially Grand Isle County is deeply immersed in Lake Champlain, of course. So very keenly interested to see what we have to move ahead with us.
Meg Handler. I am a citizen water quality advocate, most recently affiliated with Responsible Lakes for Vermont Lakes. Very pleased with recent success on the Wakes Board regulation, and obviously very passionately interested in preserving water quality.
Warren Coleman, environmental attorney, and as John said, I've had the pleasure of working on this issue for a long time, 10 years with A&R, and then 15 years really on the regulated community side. So looking forward to trying to bring everybody up to speed on this issue so we can make some progress.
My name is Bethany Sargent. I'm the manager of the Monitoring and Assessment Program in the Watershed Management Division. So I too have worked on these issues for quite a while. I was involved in some of the initial stakeholder work and drafting of the proposed rules in 23 and 24. The program I manage also oversees the water quality standards in Vermont. And so I am very interested in seeing this move forward, and I'm excited about what's to come. Thanks.
Thanks. On the screen, we have members on the screen. Jeff?
Good morning. Jeff Nelson with VHB. I've been working with regulated entities on various water quality planning and permitting issues for decades, and including participating in the process that led to the adoption of the 2010 interim procedure, and very interested in seeing this come to hopefully a consensus and closure as with John and Warren, who have both also been very involved with this together for all these years. So looking forward to working with everyone.
So is there anybody else on the screen who's a member of the committee?
Yeah, I'm Bob Protovansky. I'm representing Green Mountain Water Environment Association. I worked for the city of Rutland for 28 years as the chief operator of the wastewater plant. Also a licensed water operator and commissioner of public works now. So I spent my career trying to protect the lake. So I'm very interested in what we can come up with here.
So that's it. So one thing actually I want to do a little bit out of order, perhaps just to make sure it doesn't fall through the cracks, is actually set dates, set the next couple of dates for meeting. We have one issue. We have one member who's a teacher, and but here in Montpelier, and she can't get out of school until 3. But we talked earlier, and one possibility, it would seem that if we're going to all come together, 3-hour meetings probably make sense so that we can get enough done to make it worth everybody's time getting here. And so one possibility we discussed is to think about meeting from 2 to 5, recognizing that Senator Watson missed the first hour, but then we'll get here for a second. We can fill her in on when she's missed it first. It's not, I realize that we typically try to meet more in the mornings, but it's just life right now with the situation we're in. And so that's kind of okay. Let's assume we're thinking about meetings 2 to 5. And it probably makes sense for us to get on every other week schedule, given that we have 8 meetings and we're effectively in September now. So something like that.
So you're looking at 2 weeks from now, in other words, for the next, roughly.
It might make sense, Larry. This is only 2 of us, so this is just a thought. 2 of us have LCAR, theoretically every other week on Thursdays. So if we went, do you know our schedule?
I know we're meeting on this Thursday, but I don't.
If we were to think about 2 weeks and 2 days from now.
2 weeks and 2 days, so
Yeah.
Thursday the 3rd.
Is that what it would be?
Yeah.
Thursday the 3rd.
Yeah. Of September. Yeah, 3 September. Yeah. So 2 to 5 that day, in other words.
Yeah. Does that work for people?
Yep.
Thursdays are a little tough for me, but I can probably make arrangements afternoon.
Is it?
I have school age kids, so I have responsibilities
Yeah.
like 4 o'clock on, but I can try to find.
Okay, let's try it once and see what, see what.
Okay.
Okay. So.
And I can do.
So,
Yeah.
okay, so we'll shoot and we'll target our next meeting, and then you can be thinking about it every week after that unless we decide then to adjust. So 2 weeks from Thursday for our next meeting at 2 o'clock.
Thursday, 3rd September, 2 o'clock, right here, same place.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay. So, so the next thing we're doing, Michael, is number 6 on the agenda. So in some ways, the linchpin for this is perhaps the anti-degradation rule, and that's really where we have to start. We have to get our arms around the anti-deg rule. We're not going to go right now with the interim procedure and where we are. So we start with just reviewing Vermont's obligation under the Clean Water Act, so anti-deg rules are tied to that, and have Michael walk us through.
Sure. So bear with me for a second. I'm sharing my screen and I'm going to have to do something about audio, and this might not go well.
Okay. By the way, for those wondering, we'll take a break around 11:30. So you, no, we will take a break. Just but it'll be very quick. Just want to.
Okay. All right. So this is just going to be a very broad overview of the water quality requirements and law applicable in Vermont, with some focus on lake classification and anti-degradation. But later on in the day, I'm going to be doing a much more detailed review of anti-degradation. So it won't be a major topic in this PowerPoint. So the Clean Water Act was enacted by Congress in 1972, and the aim of the Clean Water Act is prevent, reduce, and eliminate pollution in the nation's water in order to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's water. And the Clean Water Act achieves that through multiple programs, multiple ways. It has water quality requirements for states, the water quality standards. There's discharge permitting requirements, wetlands regulation and permitting, and it has funding and water quality infrastructure, among other programs. So let's talk about discharges, because it's often the most highly visible issue under the Clean Water Act. The discharge of pollutants to navigable water is prohibited unless the discharger has a permit from US EPA or a delegated state. A discharge of pollutants is any addition of any pollutant to a navigable water from any point source. And a point source is partly intuitive. It's a pipe, it's a ditch, it's some sort of conveyance, but it's also not intuitive because a point source includes a concentrated animal feeding operation, a farm. So there's some nuance to what is regulated as a discharge of a pollutant to navigable waters. In addition, a pollutant is pretty much anything you can think of: dirt, sand, garbage, heat, sludge. It's pretty much everything. Where you find some discussion, debate is what is a navigable water? What is regulated? And until recently, it was waters that were traditionally used for commerce, also known as navigable waters, the territorial seas, which is 12 miles from land, interstate waters, including interstate wetlands, and then tributaries of those waters, and wetlands that significantly affect those waters. Well, there was a case called Sackett in which the US Supreme Court said, no, the significantly affecting wetlands is not going to be considered waters of the state, the US anymore. You have to have a continuous surface connection in order for a wetland to be considered a water of the United States. So that significantly changed how certain wetlands programs ran in the US, and you will see on that screen what is proposed to be struck in the next definition of waters of the United States. But the Clean Water Act is a floor, and we'll come back to that in a minute. It's not something that the states are limited by, it's something that it actually empowers them. But let's talk about what are the different types of permitting systems or permitting programs that are run by EPA or required by the Clean Water Act. There's the concentrated animal feeding operation. If you have a point source, you have a CAFO, and there's a discharge from that CAFO into the waters of the state, you need a permit for that. Industrial wastewater, municipal wastewater, stormwater runoff from construction sites, urban development, and industrial sites. Residual designation authority, that's when it's a kind of a catch-all authority that EPA has when they determine that the discharge is contributing to a violation of water quality standard or a significant contributor of pollutants. So it doesn't have to be from a CAFO, it doesn't have to be industrial wastewater, it doesn't have to be stormwater. It's some other discharge that they find triggers the need for a permit. And those permit programs are really EPA's enforcement authority. They don't have other programs that they can enforce against discharges. Those are the programs with residual designation authority kind of as a hook. Now they have other programs that where they A&R is subject to requirements or the state is subject to requirements, but the discharger is really just those permitting programs. Now, EPA can delegate to a state the authority to implement or administer those permitting programs. And Vermont has been delegated. They were delegated in 1974. 47 other states have been delegated as well. But EPA retains oversight over those permit programs and can make recommendations and require conditions for any of those required permits. So A&R is running these permit programs, but EPA is kind of like Big Brother looking over their shoulder to make sure that they're doing what is required underneath the Clean Water Act. Now, Vermont, and remember I said the Clean Water Act is a floor, and Vermont has built above the floor. Vermont, like all states, maintains that ability to regulate to a higher standard and prohibit or regulate activity not prohibited or regulated under the Clean Water Act. Unlike other federal rules, there is no preemption clause. Clean Water Act is a floor. And so Vermont has built upon that floor. So they have a broader prohibition on the discharge. It's no person shall discharge any waste substance or material into waters of the state without first obtaining a permit for that discharge from the secretary. So it's not navigable waters, it's not waters of the United States, it's any waters. And you look at the definition in Vermont statute about what is a water, it's anything you can think of. It's rivers, streams, creeks, brooks, reservoirs, springs. It also includes wetlands. You cannot discharge into a wetland in Vermont without a permit. And there are other Vermont specific permitting programs for water. There's a state stormwater operating permit for construction or expansion of 1 acre of impervious surface, ½ acre, beginning in 2022. State permitting for activities in a significant wetland or buffer of a significant wetland. Stream alteration, lake shoreland permits, and again, a separate permit from the CAFO permit. We have a separate agricultural permit implemented by the Agency of Agriculture that is required for large farms and medium farms, provided that they don't require a CAFO permit. And we're still working that out. But then moving on from the permitting requirements, we go into the water quality requirements. And it's basically the standards that have to be met when there are discharges or when the state is managing a water. And the Clean Water Act requires states to establish water quality standards, and they must ensure full support of designated uses. And there are 8 designated uses. Now, designated uses are not the same thing as existing uses. Existing uses are the actual uses of the water, of the relevant water. Designated uses are the goals that you have for that water. So you might not have all 8 designated uses as existing uses, but your goal is to have all of those 8 designated uses. And they include public water supply, irrigation, boating, swimming, fishing, etc. They're pretty intuitive. Now, other states go beyond that. Other states have designated uses for hydroelectric and for mining, and like so, but Vermont hasn't adopted those as designated uses. The water quality standards, there is a directive also beyond the Federal Clean Water Act in state statute for A&R to adopt water quality standards, and they have to achieve the purposes of water classifications. And you'll talk a lot about water classifications in this study group, as you see from your charge. And those standards can be expressed in detailed water quality criteria. They can be numerical, they can be narrative, they can have biological parameters on how it affects fish, etc. So there are options for what a Vermont water quality standard will look like. Now, the Clean Water Act does require A&R to review and potentially revise the water quality standards every 3 years, and EPA has to approve those water quality standards. So you might say something that you want to see in the water quality standards and statute, but EPA may ultimately not approve that, because they do have that in the Clean Water Act. They have the authority to approve the state's water quality standards. So let's talk about now the classification of waters. The classification of waters is how waters should be managed to achieve the purpose of that classification. So there are 4 different classifications. There's A1, A2, B1, and B2. Now, A1 is natural condition that has significant ecological value. A2, waters are suitable for a public water source with filtration and disinfection and other treatment. The character of that water is uniformly excellent. B1 is waters in which 1 or more uses are demonstrably and consistently higher quality than Class B2. And then Class B2, waters that are suitable for swimming and other primary contact and agricultural uses, aquatic biota and aquatic habitat. It's suitable for those designated uses. It may not be meeting them, but it's suitable for the designated uses. Now, most waters are Class B2. You will see in statute that the initial classification of waters was done by statute, and that most waters are B2. There are some that have been designated in statute as A, if they're above 2,500 feet. There's a few that were used as lakes, ponds, and reservoirs, used exclusively as a public water source prior to July 1, 1971. So those are the A waters right now. And there is a process for reclassifying waters. It's by rule. The secretary on her own motion or any other person can move to reclassify a water. It has to go through a process where the secretary will determine whether or not the water should be reclassified, whether it's in the public interest. If it is, the secretary shall go to rulemaking to reclassify the water. But that's a difficult process. And the last time that I recall A&R moving to reclassify water, it was in a basin plan, which I'll talk about in a minute. And the rule just got hung up on the reclassification. And the basin plan ultimately had to go forward without the reclassifications in it. So one of the things to think about is, what is the process for reclassification of it?
And Michael is going pretty quickly here. what did hung up, mean? What does hung up in that?
So it became a debate about the science of the reclassification, about whether or not all the waters in that basin plan that A&R had proposed for reclassification should have been, or whether there were more, or whether there were others that didn't have the scientific data to support reclassification. It became basically a war of the witnesses
And
in front of Elcar, which is where it occurred.
or declined to.
Well, from my recollection, and John and others might correct me, but from what I remember is that A&R withdrew the rule. And then later in the legislative session, the legislature allowed that basin plan to go forward without the reclassifications. And so
The other question I have is there room with a no reclassification system? Is there any way in which it can be aspirational and to move waters up the ladder, or can it be only based on the science where they are right now?
I mean, I think that's part of the discussion that you have. Like generally right now, they're based on science, what uses they are supporting and at what level. I don't know how you would implement aspirational. That's probably a question for the agency.
I can speak more about it when I talk about water quality generally, but yeah, we typically distinguish the designated uses from existing uses, and that, as Michael had pointed out, the designated uses can be aspirational, they're goals. Existing uses are what has been since 1975 in the water. And so we, as an agency, have made those decisions in terms of what are our reclassification candidates based on water quality and whether or not it is attaining or exceeding the water quality criteria for a higher class. It is more complicated than that, and I'll get into that a bit more later.
I think it's, are these classifications cumulative? And I guess by that I mean, like, if you're an A1, are you assumed to also then be an A2 and eligible for as a water source?
Well, each of those classifications has different standards in the water quality standards that have to be managed to the different standard for that classification. So to an extent, they build upon each other, but once you're A1, you have to meet that higher standard. It's not this, it's better than A2.
But it could still be used as a water source.
And if I could jump in briefly, that's something that's changed in our water quality standards. So we used to classify designated uses consistently for a single water body. So it was A1 for one thing, it was A1 across the board. We now, and I think this is a change in 2014. Don't recall the exact year, 2016, when we made the decision to classify those designated uses independently. And so it can be a class A for aquatic biota and aquatic habitat, but not necessarily for recreation, boating, swimming, etc.
Right, the Clean Water Act allows classification and the state statute based on parameter or water quality body as a whole, holistically. But it's now done parameter by parameter. And you will see later on that there's just assumptions that every water is a high quality water for at least one designated use. So, and we'll get into that in anti-dead.
Yeah.
So we have that data. I mean, you said 2014 or 2016 to establish that start point, and we're trying to reclassify up as well as some down. I mean, we haven't really looked at every body of water in that detail since that time period, right?
Well, There are waters that are eligible for reclassification up. I don't know of any that you would reclassify down.
So if the water quality has been documented as an existing use,
Right.
you can never remove that existing use. Designated uses, there's a process by which you can change the designated use. It's a really difficult process, and you have to essentially demonstrate that you can't ever attain that designated use. But once that existing use is documented, then it has to be maintained.
Thank you.
So one of the ways that we've already discussed that A&R, the state, identifies waters for reclassification as a basin planning process. The Federal Clean Water Act requires states to engage in what's called a continued planning process. And A&R meets that requirement through the basin planning process. Now I always get this wrong. I think there's 16 basins, but only 14 plans.
15 planning basins.
15 planning basins. I thought a couple were combined, but.
There was some shifting boundaries at one point.
Right. So the state goes out on a regular basis and every 5 years and does that assessment of the full river basin and updates their basin plans. For a while, the basin plans weren't being updated, but then Deputy Commissioner came and Common got involved and really brought them up to date, and they're very useful tools right now for agency regulation. So you'll see in the Vermont Water Quality Standards the classification of water uses. I won't go through that again, but I will note that under Sub B here, all waters of the state shall be managed to support their designated and existing uses. It's what Ms. Sargent was just saying. And then existing classifications of water shall be maintained unless reclassified in a manner consistent with the act and in compliance with all applicable federal requirements. But there are candidates for reclassifications.
Question about the designated uses. As they are listed here, 1 through 8, are they hierarchical, as in if they are ever in competition with each other, does number 1 supersede number 2, et cetera?
I don't know the answer to that.
Not technically, but water quality, because water quality must be protected and maintained for all designated uses. And Vermont's waters all have designated uses of aquatic biota and aquatic habitat, which are typically what we consider that it's termed highest and best use. It requires the best water quality that we would often sort of manage based on those designated uses in order to maintain all of them. And I'll talk a little bit more about how we evaluate each use differently. But there is some inherent hierarchy in that because of the way they're managed, but not technically according to EPA.
Okay. Thank you.
So there are candidates for reclassification right now. This is a map showing the lake and rivers where reclassification is possible. Standards could be met. But again, you'd have to go through rulemaking to reclassify these waters.
So we're going to get to later today the discussion about why that's not happening. But we have the candidate. And am I right that candidate waters actually have to be managed as if they were reclassified? Is that correct or not?
Yes, so those existing uses have to be maintained once they're documented, and we can get into the nuance of the challenges that under the current scenario.
Well, the next slide is exactly that. The state shall develop and adopt the anti-degradation policy, and that means at a minimum that existing in-stream water uses and the level of water quality necessary to protect them shall be maintained and protected. So the sergeant just said, is once you've identified those existing uses, they have to be maintained and they have to be protected. And where the quality of the waters exceed levels necessary to support fish and wildlife recreation, that quality shall be maintained. And these are effectively called high quality waters. And this is where anti-degradation most commonly applies. And after full satisfaction of intergovernmental coordination and public participation, you can lower the water quality. It's called something called the socioeconomic analysis. It is difficult. It is not commonly done. But you maintain those high quality waters at that high quality unless you can prove through the socioeconomic analysis that the water quality needs to be lower to basically benefit the socioeconomic aspects of the state and its citizens. And then when there's outstanding.
When could that, what's an example? How that could happen? I can't conceive of how that would happen. What the social.
We'll talk about it in the anti-DEG presentation, but there's a whole list of things that the state or the applicant effectively can show, maintaining the water quality has a negative impact on the economy or jobs. Things like that.
Okay.
There's also a third tier here for outstanding natural resources waters that are exceptional, recreational, or ecologically significant. And then the state is required to report every 2 years on the quality of state waters. These numbers are a little old. I think they're from 2023. But when you look at the general overall water quality of the state, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. That most of the miles of river are meeting standards. Most of the lakes are meeting standards. Most of the wetlands are meeting standards. It's pretty good. And you can see a more detailed analysis besides pretty good in the water quality assessment report that ANR does and is required to do every 3 years. And it's pretty comprehensive.
When you say that they're meeting the standards, that's meeting the standards at the B2 level, except for those that have been designated.
Well, they're meeting that whatever their standard is, right? It's most of them are B2 because very few have been reclassified beyond B2.
It's just one further question. On that map on slide 18 that shows the various candidates for classification, that is on the basis of state monitoring, not that someone has asked that those be reclassified.
Right, it's about that assessment of those waters in the basin planning process and underneath this assessment where they go out every 3 years and they look at their waters. And there's another assessment every 2 years, the state is required to go out and assess whether or not a water is meeting its water quality standards. It's called the impaired 303D impaired waters list. And so if a water isn't meeting the standard, it's put on this list as impaired and needing what's called a total maximum daily load plan. Now there are other lists too. There's a list where they're impaired, but they already have a TMDL. There's a list where the water might not be impaired, but aquatic nuisance species are stressing it. There's water, I don't know if it's called the stress list anymore. Is it called the stress list?
We don't publish the stress list anymore. Being a part of the Vermont priority waters list, we publish those waters in the tactical basin plans and in the basin assessment reports as needing additional data, but they are typically waters where we can't make an official assessment, but there is demonstration that they're stressed.
So there's a full kind of spectrum of assessment of these waters and what quality that they're meeting or not. So if a water is determined to be impaired, it's put on that 303D list if it doesn't have a TMDL, and there's a pretty significant list. And it's not just the full water, it can be a segment of the water. So just between Bridge A upstream 30 miles from the confluence with Lake Champlain, that could be a segment that could be impaired. And so once it's on that list, it needs that total maximum daily load. And every watershed in Vermont has an impaired water, every single one, whether it's Memphremagog or Deerfield or Connecticut or Carmi or Otter Creek, White River, Third Branch, Lake Champlain, even the Battenkill has a water that is, I'll call it stressed. And so every watershed in the state is dealing with some issue with impairment. I'm not going to go through this slide in full, but what a TMDL is a target. It's the goal. It's when it's reached, it should result in the cleanup of the water, that the designated uses should be met, that the existing uses can continue without interference. And it's effectively the maximum allowable amount of a pollutant, the thing that's causing the impairment, to enter the water so it still meets the Vermont water quality standards. It does not mean that you have to reduce that pollutant to zero. You have to reduce the contribution or the presence of that pollutant to a point where the water quality standards are met again. And how do you get to your goal? It's just like, how do you get from Middlebury to Montpelier? There's multiple options, but some are harder than others. And so what the states do is they come up with what's called an implementation plan, a suite of activities that are going to be engaged in to bring that water, the water quality of that water up to the standard where it no longer is impaired. So it's meeting parameters of water quality standards. And so there's a pretty famous TMDL and implementation plan out there. It's the Champlain one. You probably have heard of it. It is a significant implementation plan with multiple activities that needed to be enacted, adopted, and implemented. And why am I bringing that up? Because TMDLs are expensive. And when you have to implement a TMDL, you have to often adopt new regulatory requirements to achieve those standards. So that's why anti-degradation, maintaining the quality of the water, is so important. Because if you manage that water to maintain its compliance with the water quality standards, it never becomes impaired. You don't have to do an implementation plan. You don't have to enact regulatory requirements, and you don't have to come up with the money for those regulatory requirements. Now, when you did the Lake Champlain TMDL, you also did what was called Act 64 All-In, where mechanism, staffing, and financing necessary for all state waters was adopted to achieve and maintain compliance with the Vermont water quality standards as a whole for all state water. Now, when you adopted All-In, you also were realistic that it was going to be rolled out with the Lake Champlain focus first. But it's now spreading. You're looking at Memphremagog. You're going to have the Connecticut River sometime, I don't know, in the next couple of decades. You have the chloride issue with fluoride contaminating certain waters. Carmi, there are TMDLs that are being implemented where the financing raised by Act 64 is being used to address those. And there was a special fund that was created and a board to administer that fund.
Is the goal to get with waters that are impaired, is the goal to get them to at least B2?
Get them to, it's to get them back to where they are meeting the water quality standard. remember, Ms. Sargent said that you don't necessarily assess just on the water body as a whole, they assess on parameters now. And so Champlain is impaired for recreation and for some places drinking water. And
Several designated uses.
right, several designated uses, but not all designated uses. So what the TMDL is designed to do is to bring that water back up to the point where it is meeting the water quality standards for those designated uses. And because I think all of Champlain's B2, isn't it?
All of Champlain.
And so, yes, it's bringing that water up to the B2 standards for those designated uses. So there is a clean water special fund to assist with the financing of water quality requirements in the state. It consists of the secretaries of natural resources, agriculture, transportation, commerce, and administration, and then 4 members of the public were appointed in 2018. It's made up of significant revenues. There's revenues from the property transfer tax surcharge. There's the unclaimed beverage container deposits. There's 6% of the revenues from the meals and rooms taxes. And that generates around $45 million a year. Sometimes it's less. And you'll see that this is it's a unique special fund. Most of the time, what you do with special funds is you appropriate money to a special fund and you let the agency that is administering that special fund spend that money for its dedicated purpose. Here, with the Clean Water Fund, that board has to recommend to the governor, and then the governor has to recommend to the General Assembly how the money in the Clean Water Fund is to be spent each year. And then you, the General Assembly, authorize how that money is going to be spent. So there's a lag. There's a lag in how it gets spent because you have to wait until the next fiscal year unless you make a notwithstanding provision regarding use of the Clean Water Fund. But it was designed that way to include both the executive and the legislative branches in how this money was going to be spent. So you both had significant input. The board is significantly executive branch entities, and then you in your legislative appropriation process provide the final word. Now, A&R does an annual report on how that money is spent and how the Clean Water Initiative, the statewide initiative, is being implemented. They do things like how much money they're spending on sector and how well they're doing in meeting the Lake Champlain TMDL. And there are multiple other bits of information in there that I won't go into. I just wanted to let you know that the money is being tracked, the progress is being tracked. I'll let other people talk to you about how well they're doing.
Is that primarily federal money?
Primarily what?
Federal money?
No.
Okay.
Not. It's primarily, I would say, state money. There is federal money that's involved. There's also capital money that's involved. I mean, year to year, there could be significant federal contributions, but mostly the base is state money. And the last thing I want to talk about is that the Clean Water Act is one of those environmental laws in the early 70s that was instilled with I won't say it's unique, but an enforcement tool that is not present in other environmental or other laws. And it's the citizen suit provision that allows any person to bring a citizen suit, to bring an enforcement action against the government or against the person that's violating the Clean Water Act. So you could say A&R is not meeting its Clean Water Act requirements underneath the Clean Water Act. And so you're gonna bring a citizen suit against A&R for not meeting those requirements. And there's opportunity for persons to go to court for that. Often citizen suits are, I wouldn't say that it's not that they're unsuccessful. There's basically a stopped because you have to give notice to the entity that you're suing and the regulatory entity that has jurisdiction before you can actually file your suit. And that regulatory entity has time, 45 days, I believe, in order to initiate an enforcement action or initiate an action that would bring that person who's discharging or the state back into compliance. The point is that the citizens, that the general public has this ability to keep the state, to keep EPA kind of on task in implementing and administering the Clean Water Act. And the citizen supervision is an important part of that. So the legislature, very important in implementing clean water in the state. The agency is obviously very important in implementing clean water in the state, and the citizens also have a role in implementing and enforcing clean water in the state, and that's largely through the citizen suit authority that is there. And then there's so much more. There's so much more to talk about in water. There's wetlands, which just the legislature and the executive just went through, basin planning, stream wall, aquatic nuisances, use of surface waters for wake boats, et cetera, lakeshore land development, combined sewer overflows, PFAS in water, surface water diversion, microplastics. Those are all pretty significant issues that we haven't touched upon in this overview. Water quality law in Vermont has a long history. Administration of the Clean Water Act and multiple state water quality programs can be difficult and expensive. It also inspires passionate advocates, including the agency, who care deeply about the condition and use of waters in the state. And there are legitimate questions regarding whether state regulation and management of state waters can improve. And in the study group, this is your charge. Recommend to the General Assembly legislative or policy changes to strengthen environmental protection, provide regulatory certainty, and support public uses of state waters. That's the overview.
Questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, what do people want to do?
Right now, and then.
Okay, so yeah, just, let's like really make it 5 minutes. It's almost stretching close. Great.
All right.
That's it.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Yeah.
Stormwater.
Yes, you remember?
Yeah, we are still alive.
No, you're one of the few that remember.
Back in 5
I'd say, like to conjure up the name of the work, just keep it alive,
Yeah.
When I'm gone, I think I'll be the last person to ever make it again. Yeah, that was, that was a good process. We came out, it was pretty intense. I tell that story sometimes as we try to solve problems,
Yeah.
I was like, it took 3 years. Like, there's a lot of tension. Aaron Watson.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Those principles still apply.
Yeah. Yeah.
You retired?
I am, yeah.
I know you work with the basic Karina.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You're so familiar with all this.
It's really, amongst all the disturbing things, it's another, Karina, as you know, is like one of the least political people that you can find. She's terrific. I love working with Karina, and really shitty,
Yeah.
No reason to articulate.
Yeah.
I don't know, she's still, the letters were great. And he hasn't said anything. I know that she's still functioning.
We made a decision that there's no evidence that her position was specifically replaced, and it would wait, that's what
I saw that. Phrase that I've saved the choice. So that's good to stay.
Yeah, yeah, it is, yeah, I know, and I mean, and I'm just, it's an interesting time because I know that what the CAC has been going through with like, kind of the structural issues, like, yeah, it's just an interesting, it's just not typical, dealing with those type of things. Yeah, I guess so. Well, let's see what happens, but I really enjoyed, I think, big part of it and trying to help.
Sure. Yeah, she's been terrific.
Yeah, that's so great, yeah. Yeah, I'm so lucky to have her. I'm trying to get her to be more involved with this type of thing. It's hard for her because like she runs the dam for the dam removal program, and it's just a lot going on. And as you know, it takes so much to remove a dam. Go through all the processes. Deal with all of the issues.
I wanted to get all that information together.
That's great. I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. Thank you. It makes me, because I've been teaching this undergrad class in environmental law for 10 years now in Norwich. They don't know anything, obviously, And when I do law, it's a lot of the same, like a lot of the things you say, and I've heard when you testify, like it's a lot of the same things I tell my students, about how complicated the act is, and try to get to like how much is involved with it, and when it gets down to protecting uses, it's so complicated.
When I do have that
Yeah, no, you know a lot, believe me. It's yeah. Well, we're calling Jared.
No, do not.
Hey, Jared.
How are you?
Good.
Great to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you. John, hi. I haven't had a chance to say hello.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing? Good. Yeah, good week. Summer is always crazy. I crave structure. After summer, I'm like, okay, give me like.
Yeah, you've been busy.
This is the jump in time.
Yeah.
So,
Like it's a little crazy.
Read a little bit about Captain. I know you guys had a meeting. I read about it.
Thank you. You mean for this or just?
Yeah.
This is the time of year.
And all the rumors that I'm.
Yes, I know. And you think, oh, that's summer, and then all of a sudden fall is here.
Yeah, everybody hears things.
Winter soon, and then the legislative session starts.
That's super busy. That's very good. I guess.
Good, how are you? Good. Thursday. Yeah, I know. Soon. Yeah, but I'm feeling good.
Yeah, although no, you can always.
Yeah, it's gonna be fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's been a good summer water-wise.
So
It's finally,
was,
amazing how quickly.
so he's got one more year.
With Brian, well. Yeah, very fast.
Yeah,
It hasn't been like.
Something like, yeah.
oh yeah, for sure. It is a lot. But it's okay.
Everything that's in your category.
Mhm.
Campaigning, I mean, you
have to do with
Campaign, like I did have a primary,
Per se.
Yeah, I hope to get.
it's, I wasn't worried, but
How are you?
not worried.
Then fall here.
And in general,
You know,
I know I gotta.
feeling the unintended, the water line getting higher and higher and higher as we get to Labor Day.
outside.
Yeah, it's
This,
saying it's like suddenly you hit about now. It's Labor Day.
and they're gonna try back where it was, back in the deal that it was.
Back on Thursday for Elko. It's usually close this week.
There's also like, maybe not.
My wife and I were talking about it. It's like,
You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, like, what are they gonna do? So,
No, so you don't, so you don't.
and it's not like, and I'm also for the, you know what I mean?
All right, we should try to get back. And as always, a long 5 minutes.
Yeah, he likes to.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
Bunch of shreds today, actually.
Yeah.
Got a lot. Shows you how he does it.
It's not a late guy. It's pretty agreeable to it.
Who knows?
We're all retired and on vacation.
I wish I could, you know, any,
We gotta get going. We gotta keep on track.
Now that I'm done,
I wouldn't worry about it.
And I don't know all the players. I certainly have been following.
He's like-
I want to meet it.
Somebody got that door?
Huh?
And yeah, that's one.
Well, I'll be talking over there.
it's overwhelming.
Okay. We're back after something. What is it, 5 minutes? But the next order of business is number 7 on the agenda, which is Sergeant. Just to refresh everybody's understanding of those water quality programs, and actually a little bit about the actual quality of our water.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Bongard. So again, I'm Bethany Sargent. So I'm going to try to take some of what Mr. O'Grady presented and have it more applicable to the status and trends of our water quality, and also get a little bit more in depth in the water quality standards. So I'll cover the monitoring, water quality monitoring we do as a state, you know, why we monitor water quality, how we're designing studies around specific objectives, the programs that we have to monitor water quality in the state, and then I'll dig in more to the Vermont water quality standards, talking about designated uses, classification system, and then specifically the water quality criteria that we have in the standards for those designated uses. I will touch on the water quality status and trends and different sources of information where you can find that, and then also talk more about reclassification and some of the challenges that we've experienced over the last several years. So first of all, we monitor water quality for a whole different suite of objectives. So obviously to assess the water quality overall, both status, the current condition, as well as how that's changing over time. And we're assessing that relative to the water quality standards and to the criteria that are within the designated uses. We also use that information to assess if it's, you know, whether or not a water body is meeting the standards or if it's impaired, which Mr. O'Grady had talked about. We also monitor for emerging threats like PFAS, for example. We also use that water quality data to inform our regulatory decisions. So if we're evaluating the potential for a direct discharge from a wastewater treatment facility to violate water quality standards, we will use water quality data that we collected. We also use it to support planning processes like tactical basin planning, management decisions, like reclassification, and then also responding to any concerns from the community about the health of a water, or if there is a spill in a water body, we'll be out there monitoring to document some of the damages that were caused.
Can I just ask, is this available for presentation to us?
Yes. So I posted everything on the Act 175 study group webpage, and I'm sorry, this presentation just went up this morning, but you will find it on that webpage now.
Okay.
So depending on the objective of the monitoring, we have different designs for monitoring. So a lot of the monitoring that we do in the state is essentially fixed stations. We go back to the same place, not necessarily every year, but typically, and this is one of the examples, we have a rotation where we will get to every basin in the state within a 5-year period. And that monitoring and assessment is really what informs the tactical basin plan development. It's sort of the foundation for it. We also are fortunate to have some of the longest term data sets in the country on our lakes in particular. So we have 2 long-running programs, the Vermont Way Monitoring Program that's been collecting water quality data for our lakes since 1979. And we've also done spring phosphorus monitoring for decades now. So we have this tremendous body of data to help us understand how our lakes are in particular are changing over time. We also do probability-based monitoring. So EPA oversees a national aquatic resource survey. It rotates the actual media. So 1 year it'll be, for a 2-year period, it'll be rivers and streams. Another year it'll be lakes. Another year it'll be wetlands. Coastal resource surveys we obviously don't participate in, but we do participate in the ones for Vermont. So we both participate in the overall national survey. So our data becomes part of this national data set. So we can look at how Vermont's water quality compares to other areas of the country. We also, for our wadable streams in particular, we do sort of our own probability study under EPA's guidance that helps us evaluate how our wadable streams are doing overall. And I'll talk a little bit about those results. And then finally, we do a lot of different special studies. So where we have a specific either pollutant in mind, we've been focused pretty consistently over the last several years on chloride monitoring. We've also been conducting PFAS monitoring and surface water and fish tissue over the last several years as well. And so it shifts depending on what our objectives are for that monitoring. So I'll just highlight briefly, these are some of the lake specific monitoring programs we have. Many of these are done in partnership with other organizations like the Lake Champlain Basin Program in the context of the Lake Champlain Long-Term Water Quality Program. Our cyanobacteria monitoring is also done as a partnership program. We also have state staff who are doing detailed assessments of our inland lakes, which is really the focus of this group, both during the summer and then a long-term data set that I mentioned just briefly previously, the spring phosphorus. We also have aquatic invasive species monitoring programs, and then I mentioned the lay monitoring program, which is really a foundational community science program where we partner with often lakeshore residents to monitor the water quality of those lakes during the summer period. And that's really, based on our water quality standards, that's a key data set that we rely on for assessment decisions relative to our designated uses. Our wetland biomonitoring team is mighty but small. As you all are probably aware, much of the efforts of the wetlands program have been focused on updating the wetland maps. So we do have a staff person and some support from EPA on an annual basis to do some wetland bioassessment that helps us evaluate the ecological health of our wetlands. And then finally, we have a dedicated staff within our rivers program that is focused on biological monitoring in our wadable streams. They also oversee the La Rosa Partnership Program, which is another community science program that's measuring total phosphorus in our rivers and streams. And then we also do more of the physical assessment in looking at the geomorphic condition of our river systems. As I mentioned too, we have focused recently on chloride over the last several years due to understanding that in a lot of our more developed areas, we're seeing increasing chloride concentrations and are concerned about the effect of that contamination. And then I'd also mention the PFAS monitoring that we've been doing over the last several years, both in part to assess condition relative to criteria. So EPA has since adopted aquatic life criteria for PFOS and PFOA and have proposed draft human health criteria We also collect fish tissue results that we share with the Department of Health in terms of evaluating the necessity of fish consumption advisories relative for PFAS. So Vermont water quality standards. So Mr. O'Grady mentioned the designated uses. So you can think of those as the values, the goals that we have for our water bodies. There are 8. All waters in Vermont support all of these uses. The other 2 legs of the stool, we like to refer to the 3-legged stool of the water quality standards. We have our anti-degradation policy. That applies to high quality water. So waters that are meeting the minimum water quality criteria for their designated use and class. And I'll get more into that. So that anti-degradation policy is in the water quality standards. It essentially describes how we protect water quality above the minimum criteria. So think of impaired waters and TMDLs as sort of how we would bring a water back up to meeting water quality standards. Anti-degradation is really the analysis that's done in order to protect water quality above that minimum water quality criteria. And then finally, the 3rd leg are the management objectives and the minimum water quality criteria. So the management objective is essentially a statement as to how we want to manage that water to ensure that that designated use like aesthetics or aquatic biota is maintained, and the water quality criteria that's necessary to support that use of the water. So the classification, again, is there are 4 classifications or 4 classes that are set in state statute. There are more specific definitions in statute. This is sort of a general characterization of those classes. So we think of A1 as being excellent water quality. B1 is sort of a step down from that, very good. B2 is good water quality. All waters must meet the B2 criteria, and that's sort of the default criteria in the state. So any water by statute, any water at or above 2,500 feet is class A. So we have the expectation that all of our higher elevation waters need to be excellent water quality. And all the waters below 2,500 feet are class B2. Again, that's sort of the default class, unless reclassified in the public interest. And so that's sort of a key phrase in terms of what is in the public interest in reclassifying a water body. And it gets to the question of, do we reclassify water bodies based on the existing data, based on petitions? And I'll get more into that.
Yes, I think I heard you say earlier, Lake Champlain, all of it is B2, correct?
All of it is B2, correct.
That's not been reclassified otherwise.
Yes.
Thank you.
So our 4th classification, which is a little bit more of an anomaly, is A2. And those are explicitly designated A2 as public water sources. One of the confusing things, so a B2 water is also a public water source. It has slightly different water quality criteria. A2 waters, you can change the elevation of the water. It's typically they're waters that are more heavily managed explicitly for the purpose of public water source. They're held to a higher standard, except for the ability to manipulate that water level based on the intent of using it as a public water source. So A2 waters we sort of treat in a different bucket. They still need to have excellent water quality as described, uniformly excellent character, but they do have a little bit more flexibility in terms of particular water quality standards.
So just to make sure I understand this, B2, even though Lake Champlain is, for instance, B2, not all of Champlain actually meets those standards.
Correct. So not all of Champlain meets the B2 criteria.
Therefore, the goal is to move it all up to meet that.
Correct.
Okay. And that's true of other waters as well.
Yes. So any water that is, and I guess I'll get into that more in a little bit. So this is where it gets there. Actually, let me back up just a second. So the class of the water sets the minimum water quality criteria. So if you just think about this as a very generic graph where water quality criteria is on the y-axis, and then you have sort of the A1 being the best. And it's a little confusing because sometimes when, depending on the parameter that you're talking about, if we're talking about phosphorus, we want less of it. If we're talking about dissolved oxygen, we want more. But we're just going to think generally like excellent is A1, it's on the top. So that sets the floor. Anything above that is sort of the realm of anti-degradation. If the water is classified A1, B1, again, it has a different floor for water quality, and then B2, sort of declining as you go A1, B1, B2. So as I mentioned, each of our classes is assigned to, or you can, each of our uses for our waters are classified separately. So again, this was a change in the standards roughly 10 years ago. And this table here shows essentially, if you think back to this previous graph, A1 being the highest water quality, it sort of shows how we manage based on the management objective in the standards and the water quality criteria for each designated use. So as you'll see by this table, we do not use the classes A1 and B1 for public water sources and irrigation. So for irrigation and other agricultural uses, it's only B2. For public water source, the water is either an A2 or a B2. And then all of the other classes, so the 4 classes combined, can be applicable for any of the other designated uses. Within the water quality standards, though, we don't always don't have necessarily the same management objectives. So for example, in aesthetics, B1 and A2 have the same management objectives and the same water quality criteria. So it's a little bit more complicated. I'll give you some examples. So for our water quality criteria, there are different ways that you can describe them. So they can be what are called narrative criteria, where it's essentially a statement of the condition of the water necessary to support that designated use. You can also have numeric criteria, which is an actual number. For example, you might have a numeric criterion of 12 micrograms per liter total phosphorus. So that's our A1 criterion for aesthetic use for lakes. There are also in the water quality standards general criteria. So criteria that are applicable to all uses. And there are use-specific criteria. So criteria that are listed for a specific designated use. So this is in part an artifact of that change of how we went from classifying all designated uses the same and now independently classifying designated uses. So it is a little confusing when you look in the water quality standards of, and especially because when you think of general criteria, all of our surface waters have to maintain the same 8. They all have the same 8 designated uses. They're just classified differently. Sure, I still have everybody. So here are an example of some of the narrative criteria.
So just to make sure.
Yes.
So in a way, does that mean that there's really no such thing as a B2 lake? Because, just for instance, or stream, because it would be B2 only for 6 of those 8, and therefore it's not really exactly B2?
Because we started out classifying all designated uses the same, and we haven't reclassified most waters, only a handful have been reclassified. If you look at the existing classification for a single water body, they are usually consistently all the same thing.
So before you decided to do that, were you classifying to the least or the highest standard? Was there a generalization?
Well, I think part of it is that because the classifications of the waters happened through a legislative act, there wasn't sort of a specific evaluation of the water quality data is this, therefore it should be A1, A1 for everything. It was essentially, if it's 2,500 feet and over, it's Class A. We didn't have A1 and explicitly at that time, or it's B2 if it's less than 2,500 feet. So for everything. So that was really setting the expectation of all of our waters in the state. We have the goal of them being B2, good water quality. Everything over 2,500 feet and over, we have the expectation that it is excellent water quality. And we've since then sliced it very specifically in terms of the evaluation and our ability to reclassify for specific designated uses.
Okay, but none of them have been reclassified.
Virtually none, and I'll talk about that.
Yes, I apologize. Because I want to make sure that I'm understanding this. So if in the 8 uses, one of them was, if they're at different levels, well, maybe that doesn't exist, right? Because if they're
supporting, if they're A1, so there are streams that we've reclassified to be A1 for aquatic biota. And so if it is achieving that A1, it could be reclassified for all, except for we have decided that that decision is based on the existing water quality, based on the numeric criteria we have in the water quality standards for those specific uses. And we have there are different water quality criteria for each use. So for example, we have biocriteria for streams in measuring aquatic biota use. For measuring swimming use, we have numeric criteria for E. coli. So
as a follow-up to that, so if managing for those 2 different things ends up affecting what can happen in that watershed, is it that, like, which one do you choose? If they're different levels of, let's say, restriction?
based on the monitoring that we do and our focus on, sort of what we rely significantly on, particularly for our streams, our biomonitoring, so measuring aquatic biota, because that is what is integrating water quality over time. And so they, because it's a reflection of those conditions over a period of time versus collecting a couple of samples of, for water quality, for water chemistry, we're able to understand sort of the condition of that water integrated by those benthic macroinvertebrates and the fish. And so our resources are such that we cannot be monitoring everything everywhere. And so we have invested within our rivers program heavily in biomonitoring. That's where we have numeric criteria in the water quality standards. And within our lakes program, the aesthetics use, where we have numeric criteria measuring, for that aesthetics.
Maybe asking the same question a third time, but
It's okay, it's confusing.
if you have 8 uses for water quality, 4 of them could be A1, but the rest are B2. How is it overall classified? Or are you saying that's out the window? There is no overall.
There is no overall classification. So if you looked at the table of, and actually if it's Appendix F in the water quality standards, it lists all of the designated uses. And these are waters that are any, other than B2. It'll show the class for each of those designated uses. But because there has not been a significant reclassification action, most of the waters are classified in this, B2 for all uses.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I think this is probably in the basin plans where the data showed that it's eligible to be reclassified for a certain use. And
Yes.
is there a predominant one, like fishing, or like what's the most popular ones for sort of?
So we have focused on aquatic biota for streams, and we have the bio criteria in our water quality standards for wadeable streams, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then for aesthetics use for lakes and ponds, which is where we have our numeric narrative criteria. We also, Department of Fish and Wildlife also evaluates fishing use under the water quality standard. And so you'll see in the Taxable Basin Plans, candidate waters published for B1. I am not going to get into that at all because that's not my area, but that is also where you'll see reclassification candidates in the specific use. So just real quick as an example of our numeric criteria, I've mentioned a couple. We also have the toxics criteria in Appendix C. So these are all based upon primarily EPA's recommended, they're called 304A criteria based on that section of Clean Water Act. So Vermont has typically followed EPA's guidance in terms of adopting their recommended water quality criteria. So these are either aquatic, for the protection of aquatic life or the protection of human health. Human health ones are all basically a risk assessment in terms of exposure to these contaminants based on, drinking water and incidental contacts through recreation. There's specific analyses that they do and then put forward recommendations and technical guidance for states to consider. So as I had mentioned, so those were general criteria. This is an example of the use-specific management objectives and minimum criteria by class. So an example would be aesthetics use. So that's one of the designated uses in the water quality standards. For lakes, we have numeric criteria. So the management objective is simply a statement of how those waters shall be managed to achieve that designated use. And then we have numeric criteria. So in evaluating, we're essentially evaluating eutrophication. So the excess nutrients causing algal blooms is essentially the result of that. So for A1, our total phosphorus criterion is 12. This should be micrograms. Sorry, I have a typo there. Or less. And then we also, because eutrophication is a really complicated thing to evaluate, we also look at how essentially the lake ecosystem is responding in terms of the Secchi depth, how clear the water is, as indicative of algal growth in the water, and then also chlorophyll A, which is again sort of helps us understand the algal growth as a result of the total phosphorus within the water, so those nutrients.
So, stay on.
Yeah.
The narrative of water shall be managed to achieve excellent aesthetic quality. Is there more?
No, there's not.
So our lakes are essentially candidate A's because of they're beautiful?
So it's great. So the statement is not particularly useful in terms of illustrative. It's really setting a goal, an objective goal, and linking it to that designated use. We also have, B1 and B2. We do have narrative criteria, management objectives for all the other uses for both lakes and ponds and for rivers and streams, but we don't necessarily have numeric criteria for evaluating all of those uses. We are working on developing numeric criteria. In particular, our lakes and ponds staff have been working on developing aquatic biota criteria for lakes and ponds. They've been working with Tetra Tech, working with the under Lake Champlain Basin program funding, working with EPA. It is no small task to do the, to collect the data, to do the analysis necessary in order to, to propose really scientifically rigorous criteria for adoption in the water quality standards. As Mr. O'Grady mentioned, any change in the standards needs to have EPA's approval. And so it's, essentially it's a high bar for developing that. There is a requirement, as Mr. O'Grady mentioned, to update our standards every 3 years. That's an expectation in federal regulations. And really that's based on the understanding that our knowledge of surface waters is constantly changing, right? There is new science. We're learning about new pollutants and how they're impacting waters. So it's something that learning is continuous, but it also takes time in order to tease out what's going on and what is appropriate specifically for Vermont. I wish we had numeric criteria for all of our designated uses, but we don't yet. I think I saw Jeff's hand raised.
Let me unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Bethany. Great to hear your presentation. I really appreciate it. I just had one quick question on what you were just talking about with the numeric biocriteria. Do you have any expectation in terms of time frame for the completion of that work? I'm just thinking of that in the context of this study group and the time frame that we have to do what we're doing, and how what the agency is working on in terms of those numeric criteria could help inform this process.
I do not know. I think we're probably a couple years out. I don't think it would be, I know that it's not something that's ready for this next triennial review, which we're planning to start within, the next 6 months or so. So I know it's not ready yet. And I don't know if I'm going to turn around and look at Laura DeLuca, who's from the Lakes program. And she,
I know that there's big significant milestones in developing it. I can definitely, I can. We can find out more about it. Just because this is one of the big things we're interested in is how we treat lakes and rivers and streams differently. And so understanding limits of resources, what I know there's a big difference is how many folks work on in lakes and ponds versus rivers programs.
It's a great question. Let's see if I can tally up in my head. So within our Lakes and Ponds program, so we have roughly 4 positions. I think, yeah, thank you. We do partner in terms of some of the folks, as I mentioned, a lot of the programs are implemented through state partners like the Lake Champlain Basin program. And so one of our monitoring and assessment staff in the Lakes program is actually a newly picked employee, but they work exclusively on Champlain. We also partner with Lake Champlain Sea Grant and the implementation of our lay monitoring program. And so another staff person is a Lake Champlain Sea Grant, but also, a critical piece of our monitoring and assessment program. So I'm going to say 4 in the Lakes and Ponds program, and then unless Neil corrects me, and then within the Rivers program, it would be our biomonitoring and aquatic studies section, which is 4. We also bring on temporary staff during the field season to assist with the field work. So, and we also have within the Lakes program, aquatic invasive species focused staff who do that monitoring. So in total, I'm going to say roughly 14. Thank you. So 14 staff. We also are, in terms of our monitoring budget, we're supported by EPA federal funds, state funds through, the general fund, and then also some of the environmental permit fund based on the use of our water quality data that helps support our analysis in terms of proposed discharges. So it's a varied budget.
Stephanie?
Yeah.
Would you, I think it was mentioned that we really haven't, all of, while we have class A waters and class everything below 2,500 feet as B1, we have reclassified a small,
Yes, and
you're going to
I'll
get,
get to that, yeah. So we monitor roughly 1,200 sites every year, and this is sort of in partnership again with community science volunteers, with our state staff, our partner staff. So it is a significant effort. All of this data is available online. So our integrated watershed information system is essentially our water quality data portal. We also produce every 2 years our integrated water quality assessment report. This is a required report, and it essentially is how we publish our 303B list of impaired waters. We also produce probability reports. So I mentioned a couple of the probability monitoring programs that we have. We produce basin assessment reports. So prior to a tactical basin plan being developed, we have a distinct assessment, monitoring and assessment, report for that particular basin that describes the condition and trends within that basin. The Lakes program has also heavily relied on and a great tool in terms of communication of lake water quality status and trends is our inland lake scorecard. That is something that we're at a point in time where it's in a state of flux. So we have right now, if you go to our lake scorecard online, it includes data through 2022. We, within the lay monitoring program, have changed methodology slightly. And so we need to go back in and tweak how this assessment is done. So it's not entirely current, but it has been an important tool in terms of communicating various aspects of lake health over the years. And I'll show you an example of that. And then finally, the tactical basin plans, which we've mentioned previously is where we publish a lot of our, current status of water, for water quality within that basin, as well as the reclassification candidates. So for our wadable streams, so I'd mentioned that our monitoring staff are really focused on biomonitoring as a way to evaluate the health of rivers and streams in Vermont. So, roughly 90% of our streams are wadable. That's sort of the term that we use for these types of streams. So we have designed under EPA's guidance, essentially a probability-based study where we can monitor a few sites every year and then look at the rolling, sort of collecting or assessing all of that data together, looking at a 3-year evaluation of that condition to help draw conclusions, not necessarily on a single site, but how are these streams doing overall in the state? So we produce a report every 3 years. So based on the last 3-year report, more than or roughly half of our water sampled in that time, half of our wadable streams meet that excellent quality, excellent or very good. So think A1, B1, which is pretty remarkable. And the majority are B2 and better. So B2, B1, or A1, based on, again, so not looking at individual sites, but looking at, these suite of randomly selected sites, the state overall for these wadable streams. And that, some, as is expected, the biological condition is degraded, so not meeting water quality standards in a small proportion of those sites. As I mentioned,
What's the reason why some of them not?
it varies based on the specific watershed, and I think a lot of the typical impacts based on land use activities in the watershed, whether it's from developed lands, roads, agriculture, but it is really a watershed by watershed analysis in terms of what's going on for that particular stream. And that's really what we do in the 303 assessment process. So every 2 years, we produce the Vermont Priority Waters List, where we are evaluating the data that we have collected to date relative to the water quality criteria for that particular class and use. So there are multiple parts to our impaired or our priority waters list. So the one that you hear referenced most often is Part A, our 303D list. These are waters that are not meeting water quality standards because of one or more pollutants, and they require a TMDL. So this is the quote unquote 303D list of impaired waters. We also have Part B. These are assessed as impaired by a pollutant, but there are other means of regulating or of controlling that pollutant. And so we might develop something else other than a TMDL for our ski areas that have had impaired waters, because they're all under sort of one regulated entity. We've developed a water quality remediation plan, which sort of skips the TMDL step, which the TMDL is sort of what sets targets. How much pollution can there be in the receiving water in order for it to come back into compliance with the water quality standards? We may not always need to do a TMDL for an impaired water body. And then Part D are waters that are impaired and already have a TMDL in place. We also produce an altered list. So these are either waters that are not meeting their designated uses because of either aquatic invasive species or because of the hydrology. So there is a flow alteration that's causing it not to meet the hydrology criteria. I'm going to move on from this because you can sort of place all of that to the side, because this particular group is focused on waters that are meeting our water quality standards and how we protect everything above that minimum criteria. So I'll just mention briefly we produce that list every 2 years in the even numbered years. Our 2026 list isn't final yet. We're waiting on EPA's formal comment and review, and like our water quality standards, this list needs to be approved by EPA. Yes.
How often does the EPA comment on?
Typically,
every year, or?
So when we produce the 303D list every 2 years, they typically always have comments. Most of the comments are more on sort of they have questions on the data that was supplied or how we submitted the data. So what we see and published online is not necessarily what EPA gets. We have a database that communicates directly to EPA, and often their comments are on the nuances of all of the different fields of that database. Okay. But they do occasionally have substantive comments, and we put the draft list out for public comment. And so we formally respond to comments, whether they're public comments or EPA's comments, as part of our final submittal to EPA.
I mentioned one thing, the list, when it is published, it also could include waters that are delisted because data is showing that they're improving. Okay. They'll generally have comments.
Yes, so that's a great point. So these actions can either be new listings, where a water body is being listed as impaired for the first time. Sometimes we have a change in the pollutants. So we may have done additional monitoring and can identify other pollutants that the water body, where it's not meeting our water quality criteria. And that can happen. And as we've mentioned previously, we're assessing water bodies on a parameter by parameter basis. So we look at total phosphorus, we look at chloride, we look at metals, we look at the biology. So there are a bunch of different ways to evaluate water quality.
If I may, you mentioned that the changes in science sometimes affect the process. Can you give us an example of that?
Let's see. So for example, one of the changes in the 2022 water quality standards, so that was the last time we went through the rulemaking process. EPA, prior to, our last rulemaking effort, had put forward guidance recommending an aluminum criteria, so a change in the aluminum criteria. And so as part of the 2022 standards, we adopted EPA's recommended aluminum criteria that looked more specifically, the criteria was able to take input variables, so things that affect the toxicity of aluminum, in calculating a water body specific criteria for aluminum based on dissolved organic carbon, based on alkalinity. It changes the toxicity of aluminum. And so that's an area where the science changed, our understanding of aluminum toxicity in a water body changed. We took EPA's recommended guidance, adopted it under Vermont water quality standards, and are now implementing it through the 303D listing process, as well as through our permitting.
And there was recently a report, I think it came out of UVM, about nitrogen and the effect it has on some of the effects of the algae blooms. That's an internal, that's in the state. Is that something that you take seriously and look at it also? Or?
We definitely try to keep up with all of the research that's ongoing. The Lake Champlain Basin Program and UVM and Middlebury College and Dartmouth all are, active as research partners. Because of the scientific rigor that's necessary to develop water quality criteria, we typically rely on EPA in terms of developing that criteria. Where there are, for the biological criteria, there are a lot of site-specific considerations in terms of what are the conditions in Vermont. And so we have invested our staff resources into developing that numeric criteria, whether it's for aquatic biota in streams, what we're working on for biocriteria in lakes, versus doing the toxics criteria, which is a different animal. So I'll mention, in terms of our lake health, and I know this is really what this group is focused on. Vermont is fortunate to have some of the clearest low nutrient lakes in the country. So I mentioned we participate in the National Lakes Assessment, which EPA oversees. So we can look at how Vermont lakes are characterized relative to the rest of the lakes in the country. So just this map I have up here shows sort of the category of lakes. So you can lump lakes based on what we call trophic status. That's essentially the productivity of the lake, productivity being fed by nutrients. And they can range from oligotrophic. So those are our lowest nutrient lakes. They're cold water, clear water. They support cold water fish species. Our mesotrophic lakes, which again, think middle of the road. In terms of nutrient levels, temperature, moderate clarity, they tend to support mostly warm water fish. And then finally, eutrophic lakes. So high nutrient concentrations, resulting in dense algal growth, dense aquatic plant growth, which impacts water clarity, only supports warm water fish. So very different ecological conditions. So Vermont is pretty unique in that we have a significant portion of our lakes as oligotrophic lakes. So those low nutrient lakes. To translate into Vermont water quality standards, that coincides with our A1, which are the nutrient criteria under aesthetic use for lakes. So we have a number of lakes within Vermont that meet that A1 criteria for low nutrients, and I'll get back to that in a minute. The only other region that has more, a higher proportion of those oligotrophic lakes is sort of the northwest corner of the country. So we're really fortunate in that aspect. I talked earlier about just briefly the inland lake scorecard. So this is a tool, communication tool that the Lakes and Ponds program has developed a number of years ago. That is a way that they have interpreted and are describing the health of Vermont lakes. So they sort of, if you're familiar with how water clarity is measured in a lake, you use a Secchi disc, which is a black and white disc that you lower into the water column and see how clear, how far down can you see that black and white disc. So it's based on that, and it's divided, circle divided into 4 quadrants. So they're looking at shoreline, they're looking at water quality, both condition and trend, how it's changing over time. They're looking at the presence or absence of aquatic invasive species. And then finally, as the 4th quadrant, they're looking at mercury. Mercury, we have a regional TMDL for mercury. And so that's sort of an area that you'll see as part of that quadrant. So the graphs here just show our data from our different monitoring programs. And because we're very focused on eutrophication in terms of evaluating the health of our lakes, we're concerned about increasing nutrient levels. We have our spring phosphorus, that's in the upper left, summer phosphorus, which is data collected through our lay monitoring program. And then we have the response variables of Secchi clarity, how clear is the water, and chlorophyll. Again, Vermont's very fortunate in that we have good water quality in our lakes. And we also have been doing a lot of work through the implementation of those larger TMDLs, like the Lake Champlain TMDL, the Memphremagog TMDL. There's been a lot of work on the ground to improve how we're managing our surface waters, include to mitigate the impacts of our activities in the watershed on our water quality. We have been, and Senator Bongartz had referred to this, concerned about some of the trends that we've been seeing, particularly in our oligotrophic lakes. So we've been seeing some increases, and they're still meeting water quality standards, but we have decades of data. So we're able to look at how those trends have changed over time. And it is complicated. It's not just about nutrients, it's about how the lake is responding to those nutrients. But it is something that we're concerned about, and we want to be able to manage these lakes appropriately to protect and maintain those existing uses. And so that's really, the focus of this group in particular is those excellent waters. How do we make sure that the A1s, the B1s, how do we make sure that we're protecting that higher water quality? So current Class A1 water. So I apologize, it's a little difficult to see the blue on this map. This is a map that we have on our reclassification webpage, and I can post it in the chat at some point here. But we have an interactive map where you can pull up and toggle on and off different layers that show both our current Class A waters, which are in blue here. So everything that's 2,500 feet and over, as well as waters that have been reclassified since that time, and there are a handful. So the water quality standards I'll mention were under the Water Resources Board up until 2012, when they came over to the Agency of Natural Resources. And so some of these reclassification actions happened in the late 80s, the 90s, under the Water Resources Board. Since that time, since the agency has taken over water quality standards, we've classified or reclassified surface waters in the wilderness areas and recreational areas of Green Mountain National Forest. That was part of the 2017 water quality standards. And then in the 2022 water quality standards, we reclassified 3 streams in the Ripton area as a result of petitions that were received. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. There are many waters in the state where we have data that demonstrate they meet the minimum water quality criteria of a higher class for 1 or more uses. So these waters are routinely published in the basin assessment reports and the tactile basin plans. I also included a link on this slide to that page where I have this map where you can sort of zoom around the state, toggle on and off, if you want to just see like current or the candidate A1 for streams for aquatic biota. You can zoom around here, but these are all of the waters where we have data that demonstrate they meet water quality criteria of a higher class. So what does reclassification do? So it essentially, when you're reclassifying, and it's always upward reclassification, you can, if a water is reclassified, if it's currently a B2 and it can, or say it's currently a B2 and it's assessed as meeting that criteria of an A1, it could be reclassified. If it's not meeting criteria, it would be impaired. And that can, a water body that's an A1 can be impaired if it doesn't meet its A1 water quality criteria. So the agency can initiate reclassification through rulemaking in the water quality standards on its own or in response to a petition. It establishes a higher floor. So if you have a B2 water, essentially that is the water quality would be somewhere up, B2 and above. That is the realm of anti-degradation. So that is the analysis that's done in terms of, and we'll get into this more when you're issuing a permit, how much degradation can occur. That's what a permit is. It's sort of permitted lowering of water quality in a limited way. So reclassifying it resets that floor. So it essentially resets it at a higher level so that, again, you can never issue a permit in violation of water quality standards. So you can't permit an activity that's going to lower water quality such that it is no longer meeting that A1 criteria. It also would mean that when we're assessing it relative to that A1 standard. If it doesn't, if it no longer meets A1, then it would be listed as impaired. So in essence, this is, another way to say it is it reduces the assimilative capacity of that water body. Assimilative capacity means, the water quality and the ability to degrade it as a result of permitted activity. So it also means in terms of reclassifying to A1, there are some prohibitions or restrictions in terms of what can be done in that watershed. So no direct discharges, and this is language from the statute, essentially meaning no direct discharges of treated or untreated ever sewage. So think direct discharges from wastewater treatment facilities. So that is prohibited in a Class A water. You can't cite a solid waste disposal facility or apply, biosolids or septage in Class A watersheds. There's also a prohibition against indirect discharges with the design capacity greater than 1,000 gallons per day. So think indirect meaning, in this range, on-site wastewater systems, so septic systems. So this prohibition exists in state statute for the watersheds of Class A waters.
Yes. Coming back to this question that we were talking about previously, but does that mean, because there is no such thing as like just straight up, like everything is individually rated.
Yes.
And so if one thing
Yes.
is rated as Class A, then this prohibition applies.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And so right now, these prohibitions essentially apply to all of the waters at or above 2,500 feet, and the waters that have since been reclassified. So the Green Mountain National Forest waters, the 3 streams in Ripton, the handful of other streams that were reclassified under the Water Resources Board. So that gets us to petitions. The 3 reclassification actions that occurred through the 2022 water quality standards were a response to petitions that had been submitted by the Ripton Conservation Commission to the department. They they, as part of the petition process, demonstrated that our data, the agency's data that we've collected, meets the water quality criteria for aquatic biota for A1. We held public meetings within that community, and these petitions were not uniformly well received by the community. So during the public comment process, there were landowners within the watershed who said, we have done an excellent job maintaining water quality based on how we've been managing our land. Why us? Why all of a sudden, because of that, do we now have a restriction on what we can do with our property? And there, none of the landowners in those watersheds had any plans, but it was the perception that, number one, they were singled out. We have data for many streams in the state that demonstrate it could be reclassified. Why these particular waters? How is that equitable? And then also, why do we have these prohibitions in place? The activity that I've been doing on, in that watershed has led to excellent water quality, or has supported excellent water quality. And so it became relatively divisive in terms of, there wasn't uniform support for these. We still move forward with them, but you can note that whether it was under the Water Resources Board, throughout the agency's time of managing the water quality standards, we haven't reclassified waters in a systematic way. We haven't gone through rulemaking, and that's been under Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. And really, this group focusing on how we improve this reclassification process and how we ensure that we're protecting this higher water quality is critical in moving us forward, moving us beyond sort of the stalemate that exists now. Since that time, we've gotten 4 lake reclassification petitions. So 4 of the roughly 13 lakes that we have data that demonstrates they meet A1 have petitioned the agency to reclassify lakes to A1 under the aesthetics use. There isn't always broad support. So one of those reclassification petitions is Echo Lake. Seymour Lake, because of the watershed, is also within the Echo Lake watershed. That includes the town of Morgan. And so there is the indirect prohibition challenges. That's not necessarily something that is directly tied to the water quality. All of our Class A waters, all of our candidate waters are Class A1 candidate waters now without that prohibition in place. So it doesn't exist in any of these areas where they're currently B2 waters. And so really the crux is, what is the appropriate management? How do we ensure we're protecting these waters that meet the minimum criteria of a higher class, are excellent and are very good waters? And what's the appropriate mechanism for ensuring that they stay protected, and really ensure in terms of fixing the reclassification process. It also doesn't make sense to do it on a petition by petition basis. You saw the map of all of the waters where we have data that demonstrates they meet a higher class. And I know you'll hear from other folks in terms of some of the other challenges with the status quo of what we have now. Really what we have been working toward is being able to reclassify waters through rulemaking solely based on when we have the data, when we have water quality data that demonstrates it meets the minimum water quality criteria for a higher class, that should be reclassified. When we have prohibitions in place, like the prohibition of systems greater than 1,000 gallons per day, it changed the question of what is in the public interest to make it broader. Is it in the public interest to reclassify when it impacts what can be done in the watershed or how that area is managed? And the other challenge is that doesn't necessarily have a clear nexus to water quality. In some cases, especially for our lakes, those types of systems may be beneficial to water quality. So we had an example with Caspian, that's one of the lakes that we have a petition currently for, where there were a group of homeowners that had residences right on the shoreline that needed to upgrade their septic systems. So they joined together, built a community system further from the shore that was greater than 1,000 gallons per day design standard. And so had that been reclassified, that type of system wouldn't have been able to be built with the existing prohibition. So being able to reclassify systematically, regularly, based on water quality data, and then using anti-degradation implementation, using the permitting processes that we have to evaluate a proposed activity and what is necessary to ensure that that higher water quality is protected and maintained. And that is really what we tried to accomplish, or what was the goal of the proposed anti-degradation implementation rules that the agency had drafted in 23 and 2024, and we'll get into those more.
I have a lot of inland lakes in my district and ponds, and I know the clean water providers have been doing a good job. And now working with the residents about septic systems that are leaking into Lake St. Catherine, for example. And I'm trying to get my head wrapped around if Lake St. Catherine was ever eligible to be upgraded to an A1 lake, what additional restrictions would have to be put on the uses of that lake? I mean, eventually, ideally, we would get all the problems that are causing the problems fixed, but then eventually they're going to also degrade too. So how do we find that match?
Yeah, so with regard to Lake St. Catherine, it is not one of the candidate A1 waters. It's, I think, squarely in the B2, B2 camp. But it is an important question in terms of how best should we be managing the issues impacting water quality within a lake watershed. And it overall, when you look at any particular lake, it can vary a lot in terms of what are those sources of pollution, those stressors for that particular lake. Many of our lakes do have somewhat developed shorelines. And, we have our shoreline regulations that seek to manage some of the impacts from shoreline development. You mentioned the septic systems and so those are, considered on-site wastewater systems. So a lot of, some camps might be older and may not meet the current wastewater requirements. And that's why, having, when a system does need to be replaced, and the Lakes and Ponds program works a lot with the shoreline owners in terms of the proper septic, maintenance and making sure that their septic tank is pumped regularly and helping to provide some of that outreach. But, I would say on the whole, when you're looking at our lake water quality, some of it is impacted by land use that occurs and brings nutrients through the tributaries to lakes. So it's not necessarily what's happening right on the shoreline. It can be broader than that. Again, just depending on the particular watershed and what might be going on.
Thank you. Good job.
Does the decision to classify individual designated uses make it a slightly easier lift to reclassify?
Yes, so I think I wasn't in this position at the time that decision was made, but I think in part it allows us to reclassify to evaluate a very specific use on a use by use basis. And so, yeah, I think that was one of the intent. I'm gonna look behind me.
Absolutely. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Can you clarify a little the relationship between the state and EPA? There are certain areas where you said that the state is required to get buy-in from EPA, and then there are other areas where it sounded like it's state's decision to follow EPA.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So EPA has authority to, essentially approve Vermont's water quality standards explicitly. So that includes any changes in our standards, criteria, classification. So they had to approve the reclassification of the 3 streams in Ripton, for example. They also have to approve our listing decision. So every 2 years, we produce our 303D list. So that's something that gets submitted to EPA. They review the data, they review our methodology in terms of have we, are these listings correct? And they will approve that list. EPA's reach, and this where it gets a little bit more gray, they don't necessarily have authority to, they don't officially approve our assessment and listing methodology. For example, they may consider our implementation methodology for the water quality standards, but they are only approving the water quality standards pool. And so it is somewhat confusing in terms of what EPA's oversight is, but it is essentially, it's discrete in the fact that there is one rule that they have oversight of in the water quality standards, and then how we apply that through our assessment and listing process. And I don't know if you want to speak anymore. No, yes, and permitting too, in terms of, they have, Vermont is a delegated state. So Mr. O'Grady had mentioned that, there are most states in the country are delegated. New Hampshire and Massachusetts are 2 of the outliers there. But as a delegated state, Vermont can issue NIPD's permits essentially on behalf of EPA. They do have oversight of that process in terms of our overall NIPD's program.
I guess my question is that Vermont is a delegated state under the water quality.
Under the Clean Water Act.
Under the Clean Water Act. Does Vermont have the ability to go outside the Clean Water Act and do independent?
Absolutely. So the Clean Water Act is essentially the minimum. We have to meet our obligations under the Clean Water Act. We can do more. We can go above and beyond in terms of, requiring more of a permittee, or as Mr. O'Grady had mentioned, our definition of waters of the state is much broader than the definition of waters of the state under the Clean Water Act.
So for example, if EPA has to approve the streams in Ripton, they're approving at a minimum level. If the state went beyond that to a stricter standard, EPA wouldn't have the ability to reject the stricter standard.
No, they're essentially reviewing it to make sure that we've met their floor minimum. Yeah.
So if you're going to, thinking about the 1,000 gallon, I never thought about this, but what's the distance from shoreline where that prohibition sort of ceases to adhere? Or is it water?
The prohibition is watershed wide. Mhm.
So it's, okay. And what is a standard, what's a home tend to be? 1,000, okay.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Typical home.
Oh, I think a typical home is around, and this is not my area of expertise, but I think a typical home is around 450. For like a 3-bedroom home. So,
How you define home.
yeah, exactly. Other questions?
I think it's worth just, I mean, I think that gets to the point of the town of Morgan's concern. If Echo is seeking to be reclassified as A1, and there's that prohibition that could affect what they can do outside of that immediate, like, they're still in the watershed. That prohibition would apply to the greater watershed, both sea and land.
And we'll certainly talk more about it as we get into anti-degradation, the proposed anti-deg rules, the legislative initiative from the 2023-2024 session. And some of the challenges of the prohibition is a protective mechanism for water quality in these lakes.
Keep going.
No, this is my last slide, sorry. So are there any other questions? No, okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, no.
Okay. I think we're at a point where we don't have time to start the next section, I think. Doesn't it make sense, Michael?
Yeah, my slides are 30 slides long.
Yeah, so.
I could rush.
No, it's okay. I think it's better to take the time. So next time, we'll kind of be beginning to zero in on anti-deg, I think. Any policy and rule, and I think we can add to this list just more clearly, looking at the interim procedure of the 23 to 24 and understand where we are and where we might be trying to get to. So I don't know if we can jump ahead a little bit to the last kind of thing that you wanted to do.
I have a question. Was this meeting hosted, like noticed for public?
Yes.
But it's not being live streamed.
No, because it's not a legislative meeting. We were not given approval to use the legislative YouTube channel because it's not all legislators. So it's being treated as an open meeting. The way that A&R does open meetings is through Teams when they record and then they post on their committee website, which meets the open meeting law.
Okay. And then
it's another key point about how A&R does it is it allows public comment, whereas the live stream doesn't. And if you're in an open meeting, you're supposed to allow for public comment.
how, you mean public comment while we're going?
Yeah, like a period in your meeting where you say, and it's on your agenda.
Public comment parts of.
At the end of the agenda.
Yeah, it's number 11.
No, I know, I'm saying, but anyway, I just was curious about what's happening right now. And then also, do we have everyone in the room in the Teams meeting introduce themselves? I know some people are in there, or in this room, but like.
We haven't done that. But why don't we turn this into the public comment portion of the meeting? And there are people on Zoom who are there just by initials. And I guess the question is, does anybody any of those people wish to comment.
I would like to comment if there is time.
Sure, there is. So introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jenny Austin. I'm the manager of the Lakes and Ponds program. And myself and my policy and outreach coordinator, Laura Dulugalecki, are here and we're in support of this committee. So please don't hesitate to ask us questions. Happy to follow up on our timeline for incorporating biocriteria and whatnot. So first, I just want to say thank you to the many who helped create this study group and for all of you here talking today about this opportunity, really for improving our protections for our highest quality waters. My team is very excited to bring some meaningful outcomes and help us overcome what we see as some regulatory hurdles. So at this point, I share the view of the dozen or so highly passionate lake scientists in my program, as well as many of our partners, that the most significant barrier to reclassifying our highest quality waters is the prohibition on the septic systems greater than 1,000 gallons for the A1 watersheds. And that's not to say that there aren't improvements that we can make to our water quality standards or our proposed anti-degradation rules. There certainly are, but both of those initiatives have clearly established rulemaking pathways, and we have a vision and a plan for working with stakeholders to make those changes and to better measure and protect lake health. But those rulemaking efforts also rely first on reclassifying our high quality waters and having that floor be established, what Bethany was talking about. And some of you may be wondering why we haven't been successful with these rulemaking efforts to date. And as Mr. O'Grady mentioned earlier, rulemaking to reclassify waters requires determining whether the change is in the public interest. And if reclassifying a watershed, an entire watershed, to A1 creates a restriction across that entire watershed, which can encompass a significant area, including town centers and upland communities, and it prohibits septic systems greater than 1,000 gallons, which we then kind of create a conflict of public interest. So that can ultimately lead to either a stalemate in the rulemaking process or just a win-lose outcome. And we know that a win-win scenario is possible. We want to be able to protect our cleanest waters without having an undue impact on development. We want to encourage smart and sustainable development, like what Bethany was referring to in Caspian, where they came together as a community and put a community septic system up and away from the lake. We want to encourage actions like that. We have the tools in our toolbox and more that we're planning to add, such as our proposed anti-degradation rules, tweaks to our water quality standards, like incorporating biocriteria, and then like nuanced permitting standards, so that we can not allow the water quality to degrade or, not permit things to be right up against a lake shore. And so the application of those rules and standards would be meaningless really without first reclassifying our high quality water. So I'm excited to participate in this group, and please don't hesitate to reach out to either me or Laura on the sidelines. And yeah, thank you.
So just to make sure I'm clear about it, and I'm not clear about this. So if we're talking about reclassification, we're really talking always about the entire basin. Or is there such a thing as reclassifying a lake, or is it by definition then?
So because
watershed?
the water body classification applies to the watershed because what happens in the watershed impacts the received water for that watershed. So it is essentially reclassifying the watershed.
And is it always possible to actually determine what the watershed is?
Yeah, so I think it's been mentioned previously, it's not when we're evaluating or assessing a stream,
we'll look at a particular like reach of streams. And so we may have data from, X point upstream, so whatever data we collect downstream is reflective of the conditions essentially upstream and everything that's occurring. If we don't, we will, as part of that reclassification decision, evaluate what the appointing, like if we can get the entire reach and are confident that that is, reflective of that condition, it might be for that entire, reach until it meets like the main stem, which is going to be influenced by a much larger watershed. So we are evaluating not just the water quality condition, but also what's happening in the watershed as part of the nuance of that reclassification decision. And that's just to add on, that's really what we did in the context of the Green Mountain National Forest reclassification actions. We didn't have data, and that is a unique one. We didn't have data on the condition of all of those surface waters. But in looking at the land use, obviously at the protected forest within the national forest in those particular areas, the wilderness areas and recreational areas, we were able to confidently say that those waters, because of the way the watersheds are managed, meet our highest expectations for water quality.
So when Winhall and Kidder Brook, for instance, were reclassified to A, that had ramifications that were well beyond.
Upstream.
Yeah.
So there in that reclassification action, there is a specific point where there'll be at that time geographic landmarks. So like it goes to X, place and upstream. So that's the way appendix F reads.
Senator Williams, did I see your hand up?
So just, I'm thinking of a specific case where some municipalities didn't have zoning. And some don't have wastewater treatment facilities, so everything is septic. And I'm just thinking, everybody wants to improve the quality of the water. Is there a possibility that a more rural community could do what happened, was it Caspian, you said? That they could put a community wastewater treatment facility in. I mean, that's got to be a long-range plan for some of these municipalities.
So if it is a class A, so if it's reclassified to be a class A watershed, it would not be able to put in a new direct discharge of, formerly pathogenic waste in class A. They also, because of the 1,000 gallon per day prohibition, wouldn't be able to put in an indirect system. So think like a typical on-site wastewater system where it's discharging to land, to the land in that watershed as well. So
that goes back to my question that I had for Mr. Burke and Mr. Kamen about, upgrading, improving wastewater treatment facilities, and even adding some where they're needed. That that could be a long-range plan for DEC. Is that any consideration?
Go ahead.
You okay if I address this?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Is that okay? Yeah. Thank you. So, a thing to
For the record, you are.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, for the record, Young County Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Important to bear in mind that the management objective for a Class A1 water is management as naturally occurs, right? That's what we're after with those Class A1 waters. So if you've got a bunch of people living near Lake Bomazine, for example, or Hingham Pond, well, that is not really good, but you know what I mean, maybe like, even though the water quality meets that A1, we may not want to elevate it all the way to A1 because we cannot manage it in its natural condition. Too many people are already living. The B1 has that more restrictive nutrient number that Bethany talked about that's protective of that clarity in the lake and the experience that people have. So getting up to B1 gives you a situation where you can still build that community cluster system that Bethany suggested around the Caspian. Indirect discharge wastewater systems are preferable and frankly easier to permit, but they're still hard. Those Greensboro tried very hard to get there. Wasn't able to find the land and all the things, so they did that cluster system for the lakes. But I just wanted to kind of draw that distinction. Now, that 1,000-gallon per day limitation it's an interesting thing because it's almost more like old school kind of control of what you want to see in the watershed as opposed to something that's scientifically and technically based. And that's why kind of we're here talking about, well, that's why Bethany and Kevin are here talking about. Lots more on court there. The difference in the criteria is very small between A1 and B1, if I'm not mistaken. But I don't want to, I'm sorry, I'm getting into your.
Thank you. I didn't want to get into.
We can talk about like the decentralized small scale village systems a lot. So
I guess is someone in the room qualified to answer the question of where the 1,000-gallon limit came from? Is speaking to know that history.
I can do the research, figure out where it came from.
There's no one at
I haven't. Let's see what it said at the bottom. Somewhere around 1967 to 1980.
I'm gonna figure it out this afternoon.
We'll add it to the agenda.
Yeah. You got a paragraph of modifications to this set of statute.
Okay, so we're at 1 o'clock. So next time we'll finish this agenda, and I think it's fair to say the real focus will begin to shift to the anti-deg policy and anti-deg rules and that. So thanks, everybody. And with that, we got motions. Anybody else? Jeff, anything else?
That's good. I appreciate this, and I think it was really helpful, particularly all of what Bethany went through, I think was a good summary of everything and kind of where we're at right now. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. See you in 2 weeks. Okay.
Get into it.
2 weeks, it's 2 to 5.
Starway.
2 to 5.
Charlie.
Yeah, so I had a constituent up there.
Just say
Some kind of a